All right, I have a question here and then I'll scroll back to some questions on the screen.
Bill McGee, Carbon Training International. Just a couple of questions, and I'm considering selling my wind farm shares on that news. One thing, the shape of the bell curve, well, my understanding was that it would be more squashed and we would have more extremes of heat and cold, but you've shown it just moving to the right, so I'd appreciate a response on that. The other one is we send our students out to talk to colleagues about climate change, and having something that's quite, no one in this area sees polar bears clinging to melting ice caps and things like that. And when you wake up on a day like today and you can go and drink water out of the tap that's clean and get as much food as you want and those sorts of things, switch on a light, it's hard to get Mr and Mrs Average to understand that there is any impact, that there is any impending problem, and do the Commission have a view on how to get that sense of urgency going? And one of the most relevant things I've seen come out, and I'm not sure who published it, was a bit of an article that showed where your city, what that climate would look like in 30 or 40 years. So you had places like Dubbo being mapped to St George in Queensland and Melbourne being Echuca and things like that. So maybe people could understand that. But I think that's really missing here. So I'd appreciate to know what the Climate Change Commission is trying to do as far as getting that message out there, because people can't relate to sea ice and things like that.
Look, I'll quickly do the extremes and then pass on to my colleagues for that more general question.
And just brief comments, because we're getting a bunch of questions here. Thanks.
Okay. There's no good evidence that the shape of the bell-shaped curve is going to change. It's been hypothesised, but no evidence that it is. Second of all, observation records, high temperature extremes, particularly over the last decade, many more of those in Australia, fewer cold temperature extremes, same pattern globally.
Look, I really think that the great motivator here has to be a belief that this is the right thing to do. And I've come to that conclusion from having a look at past moves to clean up environmental problems. Not all of them have had a direct impact on us as individuals, but have had an impact on the environment. The acid rain problem is probably a good example of that, where people just knew that it was the right thing to do, to clean up, so you start saving your forests and lakes and so forth. Even going back to the 19th century seweraging of London. Sure, the cholera outbreak among the poorest people there was important, but the poor people weren't paying for that work to be done. That was paid for by the wealthy burghers of London. People just believed it was the right thing to do.
Just on the question of, yes, perhaps most Australians don't really care about polar bears. I think the question of how we will live with extremes is really, really important. So, for example, the Black Saturday bushfires killed about 200 people in Victoria. In the week before that, double that number of people died because of heat stress in South Australia and Victoria. So climate change, because we have to live with extremes, has real impact on our health, as well as our environment and as well as our houses and everything else. So we do constantly look for and publicise examples like that. And in terms of of what you asked about analogous climates and analogous cities, there was a conference just last week in Melbourne called Australia Above 4 Degrees, and there was some really interesting modelling presented at that, including the fact that if you take, for example, Adelaide's climate and model it out to what it would look like with a global increase to 4 degrees, it becomes Kalgoorlie's climate. They're the sort of things we need to think about.
And there's a question down this end of the room, and then we'll come here and here. And we might hear a couple of questions in a row. Let's start with this gentleman.
Good morning, Graham Larkham, and thank you very much for your contributions this morning. One thing I think we could suggest to the Climate Commissioners is our experience of shocks. We've had a great shock here in Wollongong, which we experienced over 30 years ago, and I think one of the important things that comes out of that is a recognition of why people are more resistant to change and are frightened about shocks. But when we had our crisis in the steel and mining industries down here, we lost 20,000 jobs within 2 years, and a lot of families never recovered from that. there was discussion about we'd have a tourist boom and so on, but there wasn't a tourist boom that eventuated, perhaps with the exception of this building, I'd have to say. But so when we talk about adapting to climate change, we need to be able to convince people how we link it in to prosperity in some way and that they will not go backwards. And there's a lot of discussion about opportunities, but I'd have to say our big industries down here, like the steel industry, it's not looking into its contribution to a national railway system in terms of rail. It's not looking into a national pipeline grid. It's not looking into all of the high value-added materials that could be manufactured here. It's not looking into an advanced photovoltaic system, wind turbine system. How do we actually get a debate in a region like this that can convince people that we can really play a role in addressing climate change but underpinning the welfare of people down here and prosperity through a high value-added, sustainable future?
That's a great question. It's at the heart of the Commission's work. Can I just hear two more, and we can certainly remember that question. You.
Thank you, Carl Hopley. Just a question, it's more relating to the science side of things. The perceived impacts of the salinity changes with the North Atlantic Deepwater Current, what do you perceive as the flow-on effects to, I guess, sea temperatures and more specifically along our coastline, impacts on, say, estuarine health, biodiversity and those sort of implications?
That's great. And there's just one more question. I'll just sprint over here and we'll put all of those three together.
Sand accredited science linking population growth to climate change.
Terrific. Well, the panellists want to take those questions any way they like, perhaps starting with how do you drive innovation with a sense of urgency?
Sure. Look, I think that question that you asked about about how you avoid those very adverse outcomes is at the heart of this issue. I wasn't here 30 years ago. I don't know how the community dealt with the challenge back then, but what I can see here today is a community that's getting on the front foot and is going to be very proactive. And I think communities like this really need to be heard politically and need to make sure that whatever funding you get is not just a band-aid necessarily, but a concrete step towards a better and more prosperous future. Now, I can't tell you how that can be built. You people down here in the Illawarra, you know better than anyone some of the opportunities. And I think that perhaps this conference is part of the process of trying to build that better future. But one thing we know is if you don't do anything, the threats are not going to go away. Yeah, we can see them already building here for any number of reasons, not just climate change, a whole lot of other factors having an impact. I'll just do that. And very briefly, that last question, which was about population
growth.
Yeah. Look, again, just to comment very briefly on that, the problems that we face today have been built up historically by a population really of about 1 billion or 1.5 billion people who've had access to an affluent lifestyle. We can now see with even moderate levels of population growth out to 2050, just adding another 2 billion people to the planet, that more and more people are gaining access to that affluent lifestyle. So it's not just population, it's the levels of consumption and the technologies that people use to drive or satisfy that need for affluence. So there's a whole series of factors in there. Population's one of them, but I don't think it can be looked at alone.